Let's start with, would you mind sharing how you came to your faith in Christ?
Oh, sure. Well, although I was baptized at 8 years old in a church and spent a lot of time in church as a teenager, I kind of went down the wild path and really hid out from God for really the next 20 years. But what really impacted me was whenever I changed jobs and I'd been asked to become chief lending officer of a bank that was kind of a turnaround situation. And they brought in a new bank president, and he was unlike any boss I'd ever worked for. Every time I would try and get a decision out of him, he would quote me a parable or tell me a proverb and how I could relate it to my decision. Those decisions started to play out really, really well. And I watched as we were turning around this troubled bank in half the time of what our bosses thought was even possible. And so it started to just get me to pay attention a little bit. But I was still pretty hard-headed. I mean, I'd been controlling kind of my own life, I thought, for years and was doing okay and really didn't want to relinquish control to God. And kind of, that growing up in a really, really conservative church as a child, I kind of had assumptions as to if I went down this path, all the things I was going to have to give up and all that. And so it was a real challenge for me, and God realized that it was time to kind of hit me over the head with a 2x4. And so of all places he chose to do that, I was in Hawaii on vacation with my in-laws, and my brother-in-law and I were one day out boogie boarding, and we're surrounded by all these surfers, and one minute I'm with all these surfers, and the next minute I'm out in the middle of the ocean all by myself, and I'd gotten sucked into a riptide. And at the worst of it, it pulled me about a mile offshore because all I could see was the very, very top of the high rises. And I'm panicked. I'm out there swimming for all I'm worth, and I'm not getting anywhere. And so I finally took the wristband off my boogie board so I could swim unhindered and push it. And the minute I did that, this huge wave hit, and I watched my board sail off in the distance. And then my legs cramped as I went to try and go after it. And so all of a sudden, all my props were gone, and I had no way out. And I just began racking my brain for how am I going to get out of this? And it became very evident to me that the only way I was going to survive is if there was a God, and he decided to show me mercy. And so for the first time in 20 years, I began to pray. And my wife was on the shore looking for me, and our oldest daughter was 6 months old at the time, was with her. And my heart began to break as I began to kind of write myself off. I just assumed I'm not going to get out of this alive. And I began wondering who's going to raise my daughter and who's going to help my wife. And it was really that broke my spirit completely, that just out of that brokenness, my prayer turned more to a prayer of repentance and, Lord, I don't deserve to live. I get it, but would you please at least take care of my family? And out of that brokenness and that repentive heart, the Spirit of God just swept over me, and I instantly knew that God was real and that it was going to be okay, even if that meant I wasn't going to be around much longer. But God sent some waves, and this time the waves drove me underwater, just somersaulting through the ocean, just over and over and over again. And I'd pop up and I'd get here and I'd get hit with another one. And I finally came up after about 3 times of that, and I could finally see the shore off in the distance. And I saw a couple of young boys on a surfboard, probably 100 yards from me. And with the last strength I could muster, I shouted for those 2 boys. And fortunately, they got to me quickly and fished me out of that ocean and plopped me on their board, and they paddled me on the beach. And these 2 boys dumped me on the beach, and they left me. And my wife eventually found me sprawled out on the beach. And the first thing I told her was, when we get back to Kansas City, we're going to find a church, and we're going to get right with God.
This is what your wife said?
That's what I said.
That's what you said.
Yeah.
That's what you said. Okay.
Yeah.
How old were you at that time?
Early 30s, probably 31.
So you were raised, though, in the church.
Yes.
But you kind of rebelled a little.
A lot. Yes.
And you knew the truth. You knew the Bible. You knew Christianity. But
yeah,
that's so common that when people, they know, because I was raised like that too, but you don't want to give up all the worldly things.
Yeah, looking back, the interesting thing for me was I never had any doubt that Jesus was Lord. I remember consciously at that stage of my life telling people, I'll deal with him when I'm older. I know he's Lord, but he's not going to be my Lord right now. I'm doing just fine. And that really was my mindset. So God knew he needed to break me all the way down.
Yep. That is very, very, that touches my heart because it sounds like very similar to what I went through. And it's, what's true and what's right, but you just kind of keep pushing it down or putting it to the side.
Oh yeah.
It's like you put it over here on the next on the table, and you're like, yeah, I'll deal with that later.
Yeah, I don't want to deal with it right now.
But it's so amazing how God will wake us up in so many different ways, and a lot of times it's death and the fear of death, and I think that really shakes us.
Yeah. Well, and I think also the fact of having a new baby. I think that had it set the stage as well, because I wanted to be a good father, and I knew that this child needed to know who God was, but I just wasn't ready to deal with it yet until God pressed in on me.
So it seemed, though, that a lot of the softening of the heart, or even thinking about Christ in a deeper way, started with your boss.
Yes. Yeah, it had a profound impact because business was always my passion. And for this guy to actually use the Bible that I learned as a child, but no one ever taught me how to use it practically, for him to use it practically and apply it to business decisions was very profound to me. Because I had people, my poor mother, she was praying for me for decades because she knew how lost I was and how messed up I was. And I knew it because, every time she was really heavily praying, people were stopping and evangelizing me all the time. But most of the time I knew the Bible well enough, and I usually knew it better than they did, that I'd chew them up and spit them out and just kind of move on. But for this guy, and he really wasn't trying to preach at me or even necessarily save me, although I know he was praying for me, but he sincerely ran the bank that way. And so it wasn't like this was a facade. It was, okay, Rick, that's a problem. Here's a principle that you can take from Scripture and apply it to your problem. And I'd walk out going, never thought about that before. One example, Bronson, was we were brought into this bank at the same time, and it was really a hostile situation because the former CEO that had messed up the bank, they didn't want to get rid of him, so they named him chairman and let him stay there. And so imagine trying to turn around a bank when he still thinks he should be calling the shots, and he's undermining us with the staff. And so it was horrendous, and we weren't making any traction. And one day I came into the bank, and Greg was the name of this bank president, had an impact on me. Greg ended up saying, okay, to all the staff, I want all of you tomorrow morning to pull your cars around back because I'm going to spend the day washing the cars of all the employees. And I made a beeline for him, and I said, you're the president. They should be washing your car. This is a bad idea. And he just smiled at me and he said, Rick, have you ever read about how Jesus washed the feet of the disciples? I said, yeah, I get all that, but this is not the same and this is not a good idea. We need to whip them into shape. And that was just kind of my mindset at that time. And he just smiled at me. He said, it'll be okay, Rick. That turned out to be the pivotal moment in that bank turnaround, because after that day of him humbling himself and washing the cars of all the employees, suddenly they were on board. They were like, okay, we want to follow somebody like you.
Wow. I've actually washed my employees' feet just to humble myself, but some people were uncomfortable with that.
Oh yeah.
And they were maybe a little embarrassed about their feet.
Yes.
So the washing of the cars, I'm a car guy. Yeah. That is a great idea.
Yeah.
Because I don't think anybody's going to go, no, you can't wash my car.
Right.
So it seems like you have a financial background, obviously, if you went into banking.
Yes.
What was your position there?
Yes, I was chief lending officer over all the loan operations.
Wow. So now you're the founder of the Unconventional Business Network.
Yes.
Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so we just celebrated our 20th year anniversary last year, and it's a nonprofit organization that's really dedicated to help business leaders integrate their faith into their daily work life. And so many people compartmentalize their life, and their Monday is nothing like their Sunday. And so we want people to just understand that this Bible is the best business book you'll ever find. It's got practical principles that you can apply to the day-to-day business life. And God wants us to realize that we have a calling and a purpose from Him vocationally. And it doesn't mean that you have to cash it all in and go be a pastor or a missionary. You can be right where God's planted you and just do that well and do it with God's principles, and you can end up being a change maker in the marketplace.
It seemed like the CEO that you were reporting to kind of maybe started this in your head?
Yes.
Or maybe even in your heart?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was really, after that Hawaii experience, I really went back to that bank with a newfound pursuit of saying, okay, my passion is business. What else does the Bible have to teach about business? And so I went on that journey of trying to learn from him, but also I began looking around to see, are there any ministries out there teaching this stuff? And at the time, I could only find one in Atlanta. A guy had written a sideline book for him called Business by the Book. And it was a very helpful tool to kind of understand this concept and what it would look like and how to do it practically. And so I plugged in with that ministry and got certified through one of their programs and started doing some teaching and some counseling and a variety of things. And so that kind of put me on the path. And then eventually I had changed banks, and I bought into a small community bank that I was helping to lead, and we ultimately decided to sell it to one of the major holding companies. So just during that transition, as I prayed about it, I felt like the Lord was tapping me on the shoulder saying, you keep asking, why aren't there any ministries out there teaching this stuff? You go do that. And so I jumped in and just got started.
So in the beginning, tell me about the beginnings of UBC.
Oh yeah, it was crazy. So initially, whenever I left banking, I initially started as a for-profit consulting practice. And I really wanted to work one-on-one with businesses to try and help them understand how to practically apply the principles. Well, I needed a platform and a tool to do that. And so I ended up developing a business planning model out of the book of Nehemiah. And so I would go into companies and help them actually develop a plan for the future of the business. But I was doing it through principles that I was transparently sharing. This is coming out of the Bible. This is why it says what it says, and this is why I'm applying it to this planning process. And so it was a way to start and to make some money and to kind of move forward. But quickly after I started that ministry in Atlanta that I had engaged with, they had a national radio program on 400 or 500 radio stations. And they called me one day and said, Rick, we love what you're doing. We understand it. We get thousands of counseling calls every month, and a lot of times they're small business owners, and we don't know what to do with them. Would you mind if we started referring all that to you? And I had no idea what that was going to look like, but I said yes. Well, the next thing I knew, I was literally helping over 600 businesses a year, usually through crisis. I mean, the phone would ring off the hook of people saying, okay, what's the Bible say about this business problem or that business problem? And in the initial stages, I'd have to say, I really don't know. Let me go research it and pray about it, and I'll call you back. But 600 telephone calls later, it's like, yeah, I've heard this one before. Let me walk you through it. And so God really used that as a great training ground for me. And then they called and said, hey, we have this Business by the Book seminar that we've been teaching around the country for years. We've only had one instructor. Everybody's kind of tired of his stories. Could we contract that out to you and let you begin teaching that? So once again, it was a great training ground because I was traveling the country teaching this seminar and to Christian business leaders. And afterwards, they were always lined up to talk about, well, okay, how do I do this practically in my business and all of that? And so God just used that as a pathway to start moving me forward in a little different way than the consulting idea. And so in 2001, my board kind of woke up and said, God's doing some cool stuff around here. but it really doesn't look like a consulting practice anymore. Why don't we form a nonprofit and embrace a better business model for what God seems to be up to? And so that's when we formed what today is called Unconventional Business Network. And we just kind of went headlong into switching from a one-to-one process to a one-to-many.
So how are you serving your followers now?
Yeah.
Is it just through seminars, or do you have other things?
No, so we have a great deal of content that we use. And so I've been doing a daily broadcast email that also is a radio program on a couple hundred radio stations every day. And so it's just a short vignette that tells a practical workplace story each day with a biblical principle. And so it's a way that we've been able to kind of drip on people ideas and thoughts that they have never considered and how it might relate to them. And so I'm always amazed how many people will email or call me and say, I had that very issue the day I read your email, and that gave me a different take and a different perspective on how the Bible might help me resolve this issue. And so we've used that broadcast, whether it be email or podcast or radio program, as a tool for about 20 years now. And that's been incredible, Bronson, that I would have never dreamed the number of people that has reached. Right out of the gate when I first started writing them, kind of what happened was I had a radio executive that came to me, and I didn't even know this guy. And he said, Rick, I think there's a void in the marketplace. Somebody needs to do a short radio vignette on integrity in the workplace. Why don't you do that? I'm like, I've never done radio before. Why would you ask me? He said, I don't know. I just felt like you were the right person to do this. And I'm like, well, God hadn't put that on my heart yet, but I'm open to praying about it.
He just did.
Yeah, I said, if you'll pray along with me, let's see what happens. Mm-hmm. And by the end of the week, I had a second radio executive from a completely different station that came to me with the exact same idea.
Wow.
I'm like, okay, God, I'm not real bright, but it's obvious you want me to do something. And so they told me, you need to start writing the material because we want you to have 90 days of material in the can mm-hmm. before we'll carry it on the radio. So I had friends that started saying, if you're writing it, why don't you go ahead and email it out? And so I emailed it out to a very small group of people I had an email for. And all of a sudden I started getting emails from people in Portuguese and Spanish asking me questions about these short vignettes. I'm like, no, wait a minute. I sent these out in English. Why are you asking me something in Portuguese? And I checked around and found out that there was an international ministry that began rebroadcasting my messages, and they were translating it into multiple languages. And I called them and I said, is this true? Are you guys rebroadcasting? Oh, Rick, we're so sorry. We forgot to ask your permission. I'm like, well, I'm good with it, but where is it going and how many people are getting this? Because I'm getting an awful lot of emails. And they said, oh, well, we translate it into 7 languages and it goes to 1 million people around the world. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me.
Wow.
And over the years, that's grown to 2 million. And so it's just been incredible how God used that one idea that he dumped in my lap and has enabled us to be able to reach people all around the globe.
So you have a financial background, but then now you've become a writer.
Yes.
How's that process been?
Yeah, I would have never dreamed that I would be writing, and then I remember whenever I started writing these short vignettes, at that time I remember thinking, well, maybe I could come up with enough content for a year, but I don't know how I'm going to get beyond that. But I'm doing it. I've been doing them 20 years now.
Wow.
And so God just continually brings stories and ideas to me of things that I see going on in the marketplace that may be helpful to folks.
You guys also do kind of forums, mm-hmm. CEO forums.
Yes.
Can you touch on that?
Yeah. So we have kind of 3 different what we call business leader groups for different niches. And so we have a forum group, which is designed for business leaders, regardless of what role or level they serve in. And so it's great video training content that groups meet once a month. It's usually an interview format that I'm usually interviewing some of the great guests that we brought in to speak at our conferences. And we have a clearly defined curriculum path that, okay, if we wanted to help develop what we call an unconventional business leader, this is what they need to know. And so we've developed kind of all of that. And so we use that content. And then we also have a CEO roundtable group. And so that's for small business owners that may not be able to afford some of the bigger groups that are out there. And so it's a 3-hour a month commitment for these small business owners to get together. We have some curriculum that we've designed with some business performance lessons to help them do business well. But we always undergird it with a devotional that ties directly to that business performance lesson that month. And then the third group is for professional women. So my wife just had a dream several years ago of starting something for professional women that oftentimes felt isolated from the church because a lot of women's activities may be during the day and they're at work. And so we kept hearing that they were looking for a place to connect with other women. And so we use a lot of the same type of forum content for them, but we swap out some different female speakers and trying to add a little more direct content for them.
So there are other Christian or faith-based business groups in our area in Kansas City.
Yes.
How are you guys different?
Yeah, so I would say most of the groups would be similar to our CEO roundtable groups. The niche that we've tried to carve out is truly for the smaller companies that may not be able to afford the time or the money of some of those other groups. And so, our demographic study showed that 85% of all businesses in America have less than 20 employees. Well, a lot of those size companies have heavy needs because they're even more lonely than the bigger CEO companies. But yet they can't take a full day a month away from the office, and they typically can't afford to spend $1,000 or more a month, on a group like that. And so we tried to carve out a niche of saying, let's serve, that smaller company with a little less time each month that they have to commit and quite a bit less money as well.
I love that. I really do. So what has been the most impactful thing that has attributed to the success of UBN?
I would say, Bronson, that it's really being open to what God brings our way. There's a lot of things that I've tried in my own flesh over the years that fail miserably. But when God comes, and just like the story I shared with the daily email broadcast, that was not anything I was pursuing. That was something that God obviously was initiating and thought that I could do, and brought people to kind of share that concept with me. And then I was able to run with it. And so over the years, just having the antenna up, listening for, okay, is this a God idea that's coming to me, or is this a Rick idea? And if it's a Rick idea, I better cast it aside because it's probably not going to work. And so I've learned that hard lesson over the years. And so just trying to pay attention and realize, okay, God's bringing me something here that may not fit my plan the way I thought I had it mapped out, but I need to pay attention to this.
So how were you able to distinguish between Rick's will and God's will with that particular thing?
Great question. And I think a lot of people struggle with that. For me, it's really kind of bathing things in prayer. I'm constantly in the Word to try and see, okay, is my prayer life matching up with what this Word says? But then also, I always pray for affirmation. Lord, if you want me to go down this path, just one little notice of it isn't enough. I mean, I want to hear something on the radio that says, do this in a way, or I want a person to speak into my life in such a way that I'm like, oh yeah, that lines up with what I was hearing over here. And so seeking that affirmation has been really helpful for me to kind of siphon through it all and try and discern. And there's times when, I may not be hearing as well as I thought I was. And so there's times when I mess up and I don't get enough affirmation, or I don't fully understand. But that's on my end. That's usually because my prayer life isn't as strong as it should be that in that period of time, or or I let somebody or something deceive me.
So can you go back in time and describe the emotion that you go through when God places something like this on your heart of, hey, I need you to start writing.
Yeah.
Oh, I need you to start doing this radio thing.
Yeah. It's usually the tension of a little bit of apprehension, but at the same time, a little bit of excitement. Because you're like, okay, I think God's doing something here. And if God's doing something, this is going to be a journey. And it's going to be kind of fun. But sometimes it's not. I mean, sometimes it's not fun at all. And sometimes God is just trying to stretch us. Mm-hmm. So a good example, I'm trying to finish up a book I've been working on for 15 years.
Yes.
And it's a fiction book. And I don't even read fiction very often. And so I thought it was just kind of a sick joke that God was playing on me, 15 years ago when he gave me this idea and this concept. But I started working on it out of obedience. And I remember I thought I was finished. I gave it to my wife to read. And she read it and said, "This is the worst thing I've ever read in my life." And so it discouraged me. And I ended up shelving it, not doing anything with it for a few years. And then one day I was in a prayer meeting with a small group of people, of prayer warriors. And in the middle of this prayer time, this lady looks up at me and she said, "Were you supposed to finish a book for God and you never did it?" And I'm like, guilty? She goes, "Get on it." I'm like, oh my, that just nailed me. And so I'm back on it. I'm almost finished. My goal is I'm supposed to have it finished by our summit on April 26th. And that's going to be a challenge, but I'm marching towards it. So.
If you want transparent and real feedback, have your wife do it.
Yes, that's right.
Goodness, it is the brutal truth. And a lot of times it's like, I don't know if I was ready for that one.
Yes. Yep.
So what's next for UBN? You any big things coming up?
We're seeing a lot of excitement in growing kind of our event side of things. So last year at the end of the year, we do events 3 times a year in Kansas City and 3 times a year in Des Moines. And so our last event of last year in both cities were our largest that we've had in many, many years. And it was really exciting. And so it inspired some new sponsors, and we're moving to a new facility that gives us more flexibility on space and adding people. And so we're excited about that. And then we do an annual national summit, and we're really trying to make that more and more national. And so we're doing some unique things this year of trying the day before the summit, we're inviting in other leaders from Faith at Work ministries from around the country to have time to get to know what God's doing in and through different ministries around the country, have opportunity to collaborate and talk about collaborative efforts, and just see how we can advance the Faith at Work movement more together than everybody working in their own silos. And so we're excited about doing that, and then we'll host a banquet that night that we're calling a Faith at Work Champions Banquet. That's going to be a fun time of just kind of looking back in the history of the last 100 years of Faith at Work activities.
So these events, because I went to one, I think it was a summit last year, which was great. I really loved it and enjoyed it, and actually really found it educational. Is this available to anybody?
Yes. Yeah, it sure is. I mean, they can just visit unconventionalbusiness.org, and we've got all the information out there on the upcoming summit, and a lot of great speakers lined up.
What's been the hardest lesson you've learned so far after starting UBN?
I would say the hardest lesson for me is addressing issues quicker, especially people issues. I'm not fond of conflict. Mm-hmm. And so it's easy to kind of stuff things and push it aside and say it'll get better and try and be optimistic. Reality is if things are going sideways on you, it's usually just going to get worse. Mm-hmm. And so I've learned over the years that whenever I've waited too long, things have a tendency to implode and get really bad. But if I tackle it no matter how hard it is, if I tackle it sooner rather than later, then usually you can cut it off at the pass and you can address it. And it's usually better for all parties, because if someone's struggling and they're having, a problem in the workplace, at some point we all have to realize there's probably a better place for you, and it may not be here. And that's hard, but, most of the time they leave and they come back later saying, yeah, I'm kind of glad I moved on because I found, my sweet spot somewhere else.
Not to put you on the spot here, can you think of anywhere in the Bible where it talks about this?
I would say in Matthew 18, there's kind of the model that if you have something against someone or they have something, you go to them one-on-one first and address it. And then if they're not hearing you, you take a couple of people. And I've applied that a lot over the years in business. I think the principle makes sense in business just as it does in the church. And you don't want to start a lot of gossip. You don't want to just run around talking bad about someone. Instead, if you got a problem with them, go to them one-on-one, and maybe you can correct them and turn them in the right direction. And that's what God would prefer for them as well. And so I would say that's a common principle that needs to be used probably more frequently in the marketplace.
Yeah, I've actually recently just started doing that as well, and I found it to be extremely effective. Mm-hmm. Go figure.
Yes.
So switching gears here, we both have children, or sons actually, who are autistic,
yes.
or on the spectrum, the autism spectrum. Your son is how old?
He is 31.
My son is 9.
Yeah.
So I'm going through a lot of the things that you probably did, 20 years ago.
Yes.
And what has been, actually, let's start from the beginning really quick. What did it feel like, or what did you experience, and maybe even how did it affect your faith when you found out your son was autistic?
Yeah. It was really hard to hear, and I wasn't open to hearing it at first. My poor wife, she knew instinctively that something was wrong. But if you think back, 30 some years ago, autism was brand new back then. Nobody knew what it was. It was very, very rarely diagnosed. And so we would keep dragging our son to the pediatrician, and he would line up with me and say, oh, he's just a little slow developmental. He's going to be fine. And Kathy would walk out just almost screaming, he's not going to be fine. There's something wrong. Somebody please listen to me.
How old was he?
And he was 4 before we actually diagnosed him. Okay. But 18 months is when we started realizing something had gone wrong.
Same here.
Yeah. And so it was really hard for me to grasp that, because it kind of dashes your dreams for your child, and you have these dreams of, gosh, I'm going to be able to go, play baseball with them and, coach and do some things and all that. And then you realize, well, that's probably not going to happen the way that I thought. And so, yeah, it was really hard to make that adjustment. And so it took me time. And I think that's probably true of a lot of fathers. It just takes a while, for it to sink in. And then to realize, boy, this is going to be a different journey than what I anticipated.
So as he grew up, what was that experience like now that you couldn't, do the sport thing and throw the ball, back and forth in the yard or coach his baseball team?
Yeah. We have a special, just a special connection. He's, also OCD, and so he's got his rhythms and his routines that he wants to hang on to, so every Saturday I go pick him up at his group home and take him to lunch, and he's got his, he knows exactly where he wants to go to lunch, and he's got it all mapped out for weeks. And so, we kind of do our thing and hang out and stuff, and then we take him to church every Sunday morning, and so we have kind of our rituals and things, but we have a deep connection that way. And it's been really good for our family, because when I look back on our daughters, being in that environment, and he was the middle child. And so my oldest daughter watched as we used to hire occupational therapists to come into the home and work with our son. Actually, they were grad students, so we'd hire them cheap, and they would come and work in the home.
Smart.
And my oldest daughter, out of that, fell in love with occupational therapy. And so she today is an occupational therapist, and it came out of, her brother's circumstances. And likewise, my youngest daughter, she's a nanny for a boy with autism and has been for many years now. And so, I look back and I realize, this caused compassion in my daughter's hearts and really set a path for them that they're doing something they're passionate about because they learned it all from how they had to, cope with their brother.
Have you ever had any experiences where you couldn't do something with your daughters because of your son? Couldn't take them, we couldn't go somewhere? Because I know that's what we've experienced.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, we haven't gone out to dinner as a family.
Yes.
And since, 5, 6, 7 years now. Vacations are obviously not the easiest.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and that's hard. And then you take them to the grocery store and they throw a fit, and everybody looks at you like you're a terrible parent. And, all that stuff goes on. And I just had to try and consciously carve out one-on-one time with my daughters and take them out on a date or do something special with them. And then we had a camp that the kids went to every year called Camp Barnabas. It was a camp for special needs kids and their siblings. So the siblings got to go and relate to other siblings and be able to share their heart on sometimes feeling overshadowed because of the needs, of our son. And so that was helpful as well for them to know that they weren't alone, that there's other people that are living through this as well.
In the grand scheme of things, I've really been thinking about this, and I try to remind myself this all the time, especially specifically with my daughter. Overall, this is a blessing for her because it's just helping her understand the power of compassion.
Yes.
Especially those who are not like us, who are not, in that neurotypical wavelength.
Yes.
And just having the sympathy and empathy, really. And we're just so lucky because she's always playing with him, and because they're twins, so they're the exact same age.
Oh wow!
But now she's almost becoming his little mom,
yes,
or bigger sister.
Yes,
and it's just that's what I always remind myself about. It's like, this is a blessing for you. You're not going to feel it now because we couldn't go to Disney World, or that particular time you can't go on the flight, but you're going to look back and realize that this really taught you about life. Mm-hmm. So
absolutely,
thanks for sharing that. So overall, it seems like UBN, going back to UBN, has Kansas City as their market that you're serving, and as well as Des Moines. When did you guys open up Des Moines?
We've been up there now for probably 6 years. I think this is our 6th year. Mm-hmm. So over the years, we've been in and out of different cities. And so we were in St. Louis for about 7 years doing events there. We were in Tulsa for a while. We've done events in Dallas. And, so it's been a variety of places that God's placed us. And it just helps us to kind of speak into a community and help strengthen the business community there.
So do you have kind of a permanent residence in Kansas City? That's obviously where your headquarters is.
Yes.
And then what about Des Moines? Do you have an office there?
We don't formally have an office there. We kind of go up and host the events. I mean, we are in the hunt right now for a city director in Des Moines so that we've got boots on the ground. And we've had part-time ones, people doing that in the past. So we have had some presence there for quite a while. But yeah, we're trying to find somebody up there full-time to kind of take that on for us there.
Do you have any aspirations of planting more offices or city directors in more cities?
Right now what we're trying to do is we're having tremendous growth with the forum groups. And we made those scalable so that they can go anywhere. And so we now have groups in Des Moines. We have groups in Springfield, Missouri, Fort Worth. We're launching some groups in New Jersey and even South Africa. And, so they're popping up all over. And so I think we'll probably focus more on building that out. And then if we start seeing cities that want to spring up multiple groups in a city, then that'll be a sign for us that there may be more there available to do our bigger events in those cities. And so we're trying to make it a little more organic because we have sometimes, try to force our way into markets and then realize, we only want to go somewhere that God wants us, and God can show us organically, where there's actual traction, and then we can kind of move into those markets accordingly.
So everybody I talk to in Kansas City who's really trying to lead their business with a strong faith in Christ, your name always comes up.
Oh.
Which tells me you've met a lot of entrepreneurs, leaders in the business world. Mm. Those that are successful, what is the one thing that they're doing right?
I'd say listening to God. I mean, it really all begins with a healthy prayer life and realizing that God has a call and a purpose for that person vocationally. And if that's true, not only do they need to use the Bible as a guidebook, but they need to realize that God should be their CEO, and they need to be checking in regularly on, okay, Lord, am I on the right path here? Is there something you're wanting me to do that I'm not doing? And just really that close relationship with the Father. And if you don't have that, it's probably just you're going your own way, and there's going to be, you may still have some worldly successes, but it may end up down the road that you're in a place that wasn't God designed.
Mm. Even though you're making a lot of money.
Yes.
Even though you have all the things that you wanted.
Yep.
But it wasn't by God's design, which I think is hard to swallow at times, where, I have all the success financially, but maybe I'm on the path that God didn't want me to. And that's a little scary.
It is.
So how would you describe these leaders with their team? What would be a way you would describe how they approach that?
I would say there's a lot of humility. I mean, I think being humble is, at the core of being a good, godly leader. And so you're not only listening to God, but you're listening to your team, and you're understanding what their needs are. And you're just trying to love on them and realize that, if you're not treating them well, if you're just using them to make money and then spitting them out whenever they're not helpful anymore, then, that's not healthy. And so I think it's just really those business leaders that are humble and just realize that, that's an important quality. I mean, if you think of the old book, Good to Great, that's what it talked about is their research showed that the leaders that did the best were not the flamboyant ones that are out front that everybody thinks about and hears about because they're out, rattling the saber so that everybody can focus on them. It's usually that quiet CEO that people don't even know their name, but the company's moving forward because they're actually pushing their team forward into the spotlight rather than themselves.
So we all don't need to try to be like Elon Musk.
Right.
There's a book that comes to mind when you bring that up, and it really kind of helped me think in a different way. It's called The CEO Next Door. And it talks about that really the myth of you have to be this flamboyant or just extroverted person who has an Ivy League degree to be a successful CEO.
Right.
But you're telling me that's not the case.
No, the ones that really survive and thrive are usually the ones that they're just humbly leading from behind, and they're supporting and encouraging their staff, and they're not the ones that the spotlight's on usually.
So that doesn't mean, though, that they're a pushover.
Right. No, they're usually very strong and strong-willed, but they're strong-willed about the right things.
I like that one right there. So other than the Bible, what has been an impactful book on your professional career?
Boy, there's several that come to mind. I would say, from the industry side of what I do and kind of the whole faith side, one of the early books in the Faith at Work movement was called Your Work Matters to God. And it did a great job. It was written by Doug Sherman and William Hendricks. They did a great job of really kind of mapping out the theology of work from a real practical application, because these were business guys that wrote the book. And so that was helpful to just kind of lay some foundation, challenge some thinking, and just really helpful for me in trying to help others see the way that God sees our work. But then, there's been some other great books that have been helpful from a business standpoint, like The Five Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni has been a good one that I've just reread recently for about the third or fourth time. And applying that to a team has been extremely healthy and helpful. And then Good to Great that we mentioned earlier. It's an oldie but a goodie because there was a lot of research that went into that book. And I usually appreciate the business books that are research-based because what I have discovered is usually the research proves out the Bible. And I remember I had Ken Blanchard speak for us years ago at an event that we hosted. And he actually shared the story that when Good to Great came out, Jim Collins was a friend of his. So he called Jim and he said, "So Jim, why did you waste all this money and time doing all this research when all you had to do is read the Bible?" And he said, what are you talking about? And Ken told him, "Why don't you and I meet on a regular basis and I will take you through and show you where the Bible backs up all of your research." And so I don't know how that went, but Ken had shared that. And I thought, boy, that's so true, is the research oftentimes comes up with concepts that seem countercultural because it's biblical. And the Bible is countercultural.
Right. So Ken Blanchard, he wrote The 1 Minute Manager. I think that was a big one.
Yes.
And then Lead Like Jesus.
Yes.
I think that was one of them.
Yep.
Those were really, really good books. And he's still very much active on LinkedIn with a lot of content. Yeah. And he's definitely a guy to read. So do you have what I call a life hack or a daily routine that really keeps you focused and productive every day?
For me, it's just the first thing I do in the morning is I really just go to my little area to where I can begin to pray, journal, and study the Bible. And so I usually have, a variety of different reading plans that I'm doing in the Bible. Sometimes it seems a little scattered because I may have 3 going at once that, because like I've been working for years on a project of I'm going all the way through the Bible and I'm journaling biblical principles that apply to business. And I didn't realize how long this is going to take. I mean, I've been at it probably 7 years now, and I'm still just got into Nehemiah. So I have a long way to go. And mainly it's because there's so many great principles in Scripture when you read these Old Testament stories. And if you pause and think through, well, how would that apply to business? Oh, yeah, it does apply to business, and here's the principle. And so I have things like that. But the discipline is just really, hanging out with God every morning, praying about my day. And journaling has been a big part of my life because it helps me. I don't know about you, but I can get distracted pretty easily in my prayer. And so if I'm journaling it, at least I'm doing something while I'm praying so that I'm kind of mapping it out and praying, with my pen. And so that's been helpful for me.
I need to hear more about that because I'm going to be honest with you. I'll start praying and then I just start thinking about business.
Yes.
What am I doing tomorrow? What happened today? Yeah. All the things that, that I need to think about that's not really a prayer. So you're sitting down or you're setting aside time. You're not necessarily closing your eyes. You're just thinking and writing it down. That's your prayer?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I'll just start praying. I mean, I'll just write out the prayer, just kind of begin with my relationship with the Father. Father, this is, how are you today? What's on your heart today that I need to know? And here's the things on my heart, and just kind of trying to have that conversation to be kind of a two-way conversation. And to be quite honest, a lot of times it's a lot more one way than it should be, coming from me. But but whenever I'm doing it well, it's usually a two-way conversation that the Lord's trying to reveal things to me, and I need to take the time to listen. I
struggle with saying the same prayer over and over again. So how do you get more creative on the things that you should be praying about?
Yeah. I think sometimes what helps me is just picturing Jesus sitting in that chair over there, and that I want to have a conversation with Jesus. So, Jesus, what's bothering you today? You see the whole world. What's on your heart? Where are things headed that I should be praying about? And so just having that back and forth and just trying to think through has been helpful at times. But yeah, it's easy to get rote and kind of do the same thing over and over again. But if you just try and view it as that personal relationship, okay, let's have a conversation. What should I be listening to or thinking about, and what's on your heart, Lord?
I love that. I'm going to definitely give that one a try. So, going back to the principles that you're really capturing from the Bible, what's one that stands out right now?
I'd say we haven't updated it in a while, but we had a bookmark from the very beginning called 10 Biblical Business Principles. And so we had the bookmark with these 10 principles and the Bible verses that shore that up. And the first one is God owns it all, and I would say that's the hardest one because people have head knowledge that, yes, God owns it all. But to get it to the heart is a whole different story, because that means I have to pry my fingers off of this and turn it over to God. And so that's a really hard one for people to grasp in a practical way.
So it starts with the head, goes to the heart, but then also to the pockets.
Yes.
Which is probably the hardest part.
That's the hardest part, yes.
So how do you approach reading the Bible? Do you go from Genesis all the way to Revelations, or do you follow some sort of plan? What does it look like?
It's different every year for me. I mean, I've done the Genesis through Revelation multiple times over the years. And I like that because then you kind of see an order to it, and that's helpful. But then there's other reading plans that I'll do, or I may have, a book that I just want to dive into. There's a great study guide book. I think it's called Living by the Book, and it was written by Howard Hendricks, which is one of the great Dallas Theological Seminary professors that he mentored. A lot of the great Bible teachers today will tell you that they were mentored by him, and he's gone on to be with the Lord. But he wrote this study guide on how to study the Bible, and it's really practical. It's really helpful. But a lot of times I may want to just take a book of the Bible and say, I want to go deep with this. So this year, Isaiah is one I'm tackling. And that's a hard one. I mean, there's so many prophecies in there that don't make sense to us today. So it requires to do a little bit of research and figure out, okay, what nation is he talking about? Why did this happen? And what prophecies came true when? And all of that. And so I like to just try and tackle a book and really start to dig in and try and understand it better. And so I can set and ask the who, what, when, where, why questions and start filling it in so I get a better idea of the context. Because without the context, we make assumptions sometimes as to what it's saying when that may not be what the original intent was.
So I've heard a pastor say this that was really interesting. So instead of bringing the Bible into today's culture, we need to bring our culture back into the Bible during those times and bring ourselves back into those times and not try to somehow modify it into our culture.
Yeah.
And I think there's this misunderstanding, or maybe just not seeing it as our culture is no different than it ever has been. It's just technology maybe makes it feel different, but I mean, things have always kind of been the same. We are always struggling with, a broken heart or going after worldly things. Yeah. And it's pretty much always the same.
Yeah, and if you look at a macro level, the Old Testament, the Israelites were always, they're riding high with God for a while, and then they go off the rails and they're in the ditch, and God's got to discipline them, get them back on track, and then they're back on again. And I remember when my oldest daughter was little, we had a children's Bible that went through kind of the Old Testament. And I just remember her saying, "There they go again, Dad. When are they ever going to get it right? They're going off the rails again." And it's so true. And that's what we do today.
Yeah.
We have seasons in our culture that, some countries are doing well in their spiritual journey and others are not. And so it's up and down, and that's just part of it.
It's just a big lesson on humility. Mm-hmm. So I just want to say thank you so much for coming today. I'm very honored that you chose to be a guest on this little podcast that we've started. I really respect everything you're doing with the UBN and really taking a stand on what matters most, and especially with really life.
Yes.
And trying to incorporate that in the business industry. So thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you, Bronson, for having me. This has been a lot of fun.